Welcome back, everybody. Today we're looking at something pretty interesting, the whole world of language and society.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and we're going to be focusing on one chapter in particular. It's chapter 13, Language in Social Contexts, from a contemporary linguistics textbook.
Okay, great.
So have you ever, noticed how you kind of change the way you talk, depending on who you're talking to or where you are?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what we're diving into today.
Awesome.
We're going to go from things like regional dialects and standard language to how social class can actually be reflected in the way we speak.
Sounds fascinating.
So to help us make sense of all this, we've got our sociolinguistics expert here.
Happy to be here.
All right, so maybe let's just start with, what exactly is sociolinguistics?
Well, essentially, it's all about how language actually functions within a society. And it kind of recognizes that language, it's not static.
Right.
It's constantly evolving and adapting.
Yeah, you think about it, we switch up our language all the time, right?
Oh, for sure.
Like if you're talking to your friends. Versus at work, you'd probably use different words or phrases.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. And a key idea in sociolinguistics is this thing called speech communities.
Okay.
So these are groups of people who not only share a language, but also all these social norms and expectations about how that language should be USD.
So it's more than just speaking the same language.
It is.
It's this shared understanding of the rules of engagement almost.
Precisely. And the textbook actually gives a great example of this. It's this shared understanding of what's considered polite or rude, formal or informal. And these kind of unspoken rules can vary a lot between different speech communities.
Yeah.
So something that might be a totally normal greeting in one community could be super inappropriate in another one.
Oh, totally.
So it makes you think, what are some of those unspoken language rules that are operating in your social circles?
That's a really good question. It makes you realize how much we take those rules for granted. Okay, so let's move on to something I've always found super interesting, dialects.
Okay.
What exactly defines a dialect? And is there really such a thing as correct language?
Well, dialects, they're basically just variations in pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, all tied to specific regions or social groups. And there's this classic example from the textbook. It's this map that shows darning needle versus dragonfly.
Oh, I've seen that one.
Yeah, it shows how even the name for a common insect can be totally different across different regions in the U.S.
Right.
And it highlights a really important point. There isn't one correct way to speak a language.
Right.
This whole idea of a standard language, it's more of a social construct than a linguistic reality.
Okay.
It's just a dialect that's gained prestige over time, often because of political or economic influences.
That map is such a good example of how ingrained these regional variations can be.
It is.
It really does make you question that whole one right way to speak thing.
For sure.
So if standard language is just one dialect among many, how does it actually get that elevated position?
Well, that's a great question. And it really gets to the heart of how language and power are connected.
Okay.
So typically the dialect that becomes the standard is the one that's associated with the people in power. So historically, this has often been the elite or those with political or economic sway.
Right.
Think about a lot of European countries where the standard language is based on the dialect of the capital city.
Makes sense.
Historically, capitals were the centers of power.
Right.
So naturally, their dialect gained prominence.
It's crazy how these power dynamics can actually shape something as fundamental as language.
It really is.
And speaking of power dynamics, the textbook talks quite a bit about the connection between social class and language.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Another area where power comes into play.
Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting. Lots of studies have actually shown that speech patterns can reveal a speaker's social class.
Really?
Yeah, the textbook highlights some classic studies like Labou's research in New York City. It showed a correlation between how people pronounce the sounds and their social class.
Oh, interesting.
And there's also Truggill's work on vowel fronting in Norwich, England.
I've heard of that one.
Which found similar patterns.
So even small variations in pronunciation can have social significance.
They can.
Wow, it affects how we perceive and are perceived by others.
Exactly. And these patterns, they're actually surprisingly consistent across different social contexts.
That's wild.
Yeah. And it raises the question, does moving up in social class lead to language change in a person? Or does changing your language make social mobility more likely?
Oh, it's like a chicken and egg thing.
It really is. It's a sociolinguistic puzzle.
So before we move on, I want to touch on The whole thing about social networks.
Okay.
How do our social connections actually influence the way we speak?
Well, social networks are super important for understanding how language changes
Right.
and how it varies within a community. So the Milroys, they've done a ton of research in this area, and they found that these dense, close-knit networks tend to reinforce local dialects.
So even if a dialect is seen as low prestige by the wider society,
Right.
it can thrive within a tight-knit community.
Exactly. They act as this linguistic incubator almost,
Interesting.
preserving and continuing these unique language features.
Like, think about teenagers and how they develop slang.
Oh, yeah. Perfect example.
In their friend groups.
It's that same principle at work.
Right. Those close connections help maintain and spread those variations.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about broader social categories like class.
Right.
It's about who we interact with regularly.
Exactly. The microdynamics of our everyday interactions.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about another fascinating aspect.
Okay.
Gender.
All right.
How does gender influence language use?
Yeah, this is a good one. And I know there's a lot of stereotypes out there about how men and women speak.
Oh, tons.
But the research actually goes beyond those simple stereotypes.
Okay, so what does it say?
Well, one consistent finding is that women on average tend to use more standard language forms than men from similar backgrounds.
That's interesting. Why might that be?
Well, there's a few possible explanations.
Okay.
One theory is that women are often socialized to be more aware of and sensitive to those prestige norms in language.
So they're upholding the standard almost.
In a way, yeah. Another perspective is that it could be a strategy for navigating male-dominated spaces, where using those more standard forms might be a way to assert authority or credibility.
Oh, so it's like a way of dealing with those power imbalances.
Exactly. It's a great example of how one linguistic pattern can have multiple social interpretations and motivations.
Right, and it really makes us think more critically about why these patterns exist.
Exactly, and to consider different viewpoints.
It definitely challenges some assumptions we might have about language.
It does.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more crucial factor, time.
Okay.
How does language change over time?
Well, you're right that language change, it often happens very subtly.
Yeah.
And it unfolds over long periods of time.
Yeah.
But it's a constant process.
Right.
Sounds in particular, they tend to shift gradually over time.
Okay.
And the textbook gives a great example, the northern cities' vowel shift.
Oh, right.
Where vowel sounds are slowly changing in a chain reaction across major U.S. cities.
So even within a dialect, that seems pretty uniform. There's constant change happening under the surface.
And exactly, driven by time and social interaction.
And it makes me think about those memes, like the how do you pronounce memes that highlight those generational differences in pronunciation, or like little glimpses into this gradual, time-driven language change.
AR.
And it makes you wonder what shifts are happening right now that we might not even be aware of.
It really does.
That we'll only notice years down the line.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
So much to think about. But we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into even more fascinating aspects of language change.
Sounds good. Welcome back, and before the break, we were talking about how language changes over time. And it's such a fascinating process that often we don't even notice it's happening until the changes have become pretty noticeable. One way that linguists actually track these changes is by studying something called linguistic isolations.
Linguistic isolations.
Yeah.
That sounds interesting. Does that mean communities that are literally isolated, like people living on remote islands or something?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. It often does involve geographically isolated communities, but it's a bit broader than that.
Okay.
Linguistic isolation can happen because of that physical separation you mentioned, but it can also happen because of social or cultural factors that create those linguistic boundaries even within like a larger society.
So it's about any kind of separation that limits interaction and that leads to these unique linguistic features being preserved or even new varieties developing.
Exactly. And probably the easiest one to understand is physical isolation. Like imagine a small island community. They don't have a ton of contact with the mainland over generations. Their dialect might evolve in ways that are different from the mainland dialect. They might preserve older forms or develop new ones. And the textbook mentions this fascinating example of Smith Island. It's off the coast of Maryland. And because of that relative isolation, Its dialect has kept some features of 17th century English
Wow.
that have totally vanished from mainland dialects.
It's like a linguistic time capsule.
It gives us a glimpse into the past, preserving parts of the language that most English speakers don't use anymore.
That's so cool. But you mentioned that linguistic isolation can happen even without these physical barriers. Like, what would be an example of that?
Well, Quebec French is a great example.
Okay.
So geographically, it's part of Canada, obviously.
Right.
But the French-speaking community in Quebec has experienced this kind of linguistic isolation from the wider French-speaking world. And that's led to some really distinctive features in their dialect, particularly in pronunciation and grammar, that set it apart from other varieties of French.
So even without physical barriers, those social and cultural factors can create these pockets where these unique variations can just thrive. It really highlights how language is shaped by the communities that use it.
For sure. The textbook also talks about social isolation. How is that different from what we've been discussing?
Yeah, good question.
So social isolation, as the name suggests, it's when a smaller speech community within a larger society becomes isolated not because of geography or a different language, but because of social factors like class, race, or ethnicity.
Yeah.
A good example is African American English, often called AAE.
Right.
And it developed in this context of social isolation, which led to some unique linguistic features that set it apart from other varieties of English.
Yeah, and that example really highlights how language can be this powerful marker of identity, but also, unfortunately, a tool for exclusion.
Sadly, yes.
It's a reminder that language isn't just about communication.
It's not.
It's woven into all these social power dynamics.
Absolutely. And these dynamics are always at play, shaping how languages evolve and diversify. Another way we see this is through language contact, which is when speakers of different languages or dialects come into contact with each other.
I imagine situations like immigration or historical trade routes where people speaking different languages were brought together.
Exactly. And language contact can lead to all sorts of interesting things. Sometimes it results in borrowing, where words or phrases from one language get adopted into another. Think about all the words English has borrowed from French, Spanish, countless other languages over its history.
Right.
In other cases, language contact can actually create entirely new languages called pidgins and creoles.
Pidgins and creoles, they always sound so fascinating. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. A pidgin is a simplified language that emerges when speakers of different languages need to communicate, but they don't have a common language. It's characterized by a limited vocabulary and grammar, often drawing elements from the languages in contact.
Okay.
Imagine a scenario where traders from different countries need to communicate to do business. A pidgin might develop as a way to facilitate those basic transactions.
So it's like this makeshift language born out of necessity just to bridge the communication gap.
Exactly. Pidgins often arise in situations like trade or colonization, where people from all these different linguistic backgrounds are forced together. Now, a creole takes this a step further. It develops when a pidgin actually becomes the native language of a community.
Okay.
So over time, it expands and becomes more complex. It develops a richer grammar and vocabulary to meet the changing needs of its speakers.
So a creole is like a pidgin that's grown up and become more sophisticated.
Creoles are really interesting. They provide this unique window into the processes of language creation and evolution. They demonstrate how flexible and adaptable human language is, its ability to change and evolve to meet these new demands for communication.
We've covered so much ground today, from dialects and standard language to social class, gender, time, isolation, contact, pidgins, and creoles. It's incredible how much there is to explore when you start looking at language in its social context.
It really is a vast and complex field, and we've just scratched the surface. There's still so much to learn and discover about this intricate relationship between language and society.
Before we wrap up this segment, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about language and social distinctions within a community.
Yeah.
It seems like we've been focusing on the differences between communities, but there's this whole other layer of complexity within those communities as well.
That's a crucial point. This area of study helps us understand how language can both reflect and reinforce those existing social hierarchies that exist within a given community. The textbook really hones in on three key factors: class, ethnicity, and gender.
So it's not just about how different communities speak, it's about how individuals within a community use language to position themselves socially. It's like these subtle ways we signal our social identities and navigate those social hierarchies.
Exactly. Let's start with class. We often see this clear correlation between social class and language use. Individuals from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tend to use more standard language forms, while those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds might use more non-standard forms.
Okay.
It's not a hard and fast rule, of course, but it's a general trend that we observe across different social contexts.
That reminds me of those Lebov and Treadgill studies we discussed earlier. Those seemingly minor differences in pronunciation can actually be linked to a speaker's social standing.
Yeah, exactly.
It really highlights how language is never neutral.
It's not.
It carries this social weight.
For sure, those studies are classic examples of how class can be reflected in these tiny little details of pronunciation. The textbook also explores how ethnicity shapes language use with African American English, or AAE, as a key example. AAE has its own distinct set of features in terms of pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary, reflecting its unique history and cultural contexts.
And it's important to emphasize that AAE, like any dialect, is a valid and rule-governed linguistic system.
Absolutely.
It's not just incorrect English, as some people mistakenly believe.
Right. It's a vibrant and expressive variety of English with its own internal logic and grammatical rules.
Exactly. And finally, we have gender. Another crucial dimension of social distinction within a community, as we touched on earlier. Research has consistently shown differences in how men and women use language. And these differences, while often subtle, can have significant social consequences.
For sure.
Like that finding that women tend to use more standard forms, potentially because of societal expectations or those power dynamics. It shows how language can both reflect and reinforce gender roles and power structures.
It does those seemingly small linguistic variations. They can be interconnected with these larger social issues and power dynamics. It's a reminder that sociolinguistics isn't just about studying abstract linguistic systems. It's about understanding how language functions as this tool for social interaction and how it's tied to these broader social and cultural forces.
Oh, we've definitely covered a lot of ground today, and it's clear that sociolinguistics is this rich and multifaceted field. But before we delve even deeper into this fascinating subject, let's take a moment to process all this incredible information. We'll be back shortly to explore even more insights from Chapter 13. All right, so welcome back to our deep dive into sociolinguistics. We've covered some really interesting stuff, from dialects and pronunciation to social networks and how languages evolve. But there's one more crucial aspect I want to get into, how language actually plays out in real-world interactions.
Definitely. Up to this point, we've been talking about language in a kind of theoretical way. But the real magic of sociolinguistics is seeing how language works in everyday conversations. And that's where this idea of the ethnography of communication comes in.
Ethnography of communication. It sounds like we're about to zoom in on those tiny details of human interaction.
Exactly. It's basically a method that sociolinguists use to study how people use language in different social situations.
So it's like we're putting a magnifying glass on those everyday conversations.
We are.
And analyzing things like turn-taking topic management, the different styles of speech people use.
Exactly. All those subtle cues that shape the meaning and the social dynamics of an interaction.
So it's about understanding those unspoken rules of conversation.
It is.
Like how we know when it's our turn to speak.
Right.
How we introduce new topics. Whether we use formal or informal language. All those things that contribute to the flow and the meaning.
Yeah, all of that. And the textbook uses this example of a customer and a salesperson interacting. And it makes you think about how their language choices, their forms of address, the topics they talk about, even the tone of their voices are all influenced by that social context of a retail setting.
It makes you realize that we're constantly reading between the lines in conversations, interpreting those unspoken cues to understand what's really going on.
Exactly. We're all navigating these social dances without even thinking about it.
Right. It's fascinating. So speaking of social dynamics, we've talked a lot about power and solidarity.
Yeah.
How do those concepts actually show up in our everyday conversations?
Well, one way we see power and solidarity is through forms of address.
Okay.
In many languages, there are different ways to address someone, formal and informal.
Right.
And which form you use often depends on the power dynamic between the speakers.
Like using sir or ma'am to show respect to someone in a position of authority.
Exactly. Or using someone's professional title, like doctor or professor.
Right. It's like acknowledging their status.
Precisely. Those are clear examples of how language reflects power. And then on the flip side, using someone's first name can signal a more equal relationship, emphasizing that solidarity or closeness.
It's a subtle but powerful way of navigating those social distances.
Absolutely. It shows how strategic we are with language, using it to position ourselves within these social hierarchies.
We're always making choices consciously or unconsciously,
We are.
about how we use language to signal who we are and what we want.
Exactly. And that's what makes sociolinguistics so interesting. It's about understanding those complexities,
Right.
seeing how language works as a social tool.
So before we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about sociolinguistics being a relatively young field. What are some of those big unanswered questions that are still driving research in this area?
Well, one of the biggest questions is the relationship between language and thought.
Oh, that's a good one.
To what extent does the language we speak actually shape how we think about the world?
That's a question that's been around for centuries.
It has.
It gets to the heart of what it means to be human.
Exactly.
And it's still being debated today.
It is. Another really exciting area of research right now is the impact of globalization and technology on language.
Okay.
With social media and increased mobility, languages are coming into contact more than ever before.
Right.
And it's leading to these fascinating new trends.
Like what?
More code switching between languages, the blending of languages in new ways, and maybe even the emergence of entirely new varieties.
Like the linguistic landscape is being reshaped.
It is. Those traditional boundaries are blurring, and it's creating these new possibilities for expression.
It seems like sociolinguistics is all about capturing that dynamic, ever-changing nature of language.
It is. It's not just about studying these static systems.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. This deep dive into Chapter 13 has been amazing.
It has.
It's really opened our eyes to the ways that language and society are connected.
They really are.
And it's clear that language is so much more than just a way to convey information. It's a reflection of who we are, where we come from, how we connect with each other.
Absolutely.
And how we understand the world around us.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise. And a huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on this linguistic journey.
Thanks, everyone.
We hope you've gained some new insights into the power of language, and that you'll keep being curious about the amazing ways it shapes our social world.
Keep exploring.
Until next time, keep those ears perked. And remember, every conversation, every interaction is a window into the complexity of human experience.
Show support, like, subscribe, share, comment.